So all of our speakers today are doing cutting edge work to better identify, understand, and combat human trafficking. And I hope this session today will bring attention to and catalyze new kinds of discussions on this issue and problem of human trafficking.
Thank you, Kathleen, for the invitation. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of a journey on sort of the work here that I've been leading on responsible AI for addressing modern slavery, and how this has really cut across sort of very thematic areas at the Alan Turing Institute around defense and security and online harms and various other spaces. Ooh, let's see if this works. So basically, my work as a lead around AI and human rights has really been looking at this from parallel themes of work in which, on one hand, we have human rights challenges or issues such as modern slavery, which again cuts across, as mentioned before, areas and sectors such as defense and security, criminal justice, labor employment, health, and various other sectors, making it a very complex, transnational, and evolving space as it relates to the legal sphere as well. And increasingly, we've also seen data growing exponentially. And alongside, as we've been hearing, there's been this growing interest around data and AI as being a powerful tool that can potentially support various sectors to enhance capability. And it's sometimes perceived as a game changer. However, again, in my space of looking at this from a human rights perspective, and I've primarily engaged in the intersection of data, statistics, and AI as it intersects with the law, it then becomes an issue of whether or not it is an emerging nexus or an inescapable nemesis. So as we know, there are great opportunities, but with the use of AI, and I will qualify by saying AI as not generalized AI for the most part, but task-specific models that we're using here, or machine learning models. And so while it has the great opportunity to address some of the challenges that we are interested in determining, whether that's prevention, detection, it also has a great potential to infringe on human rights. And when we're working with people with lived experiences and the data of real people, these become even more pronounced, with particular concerns around privacy and discrimination, but also how there is mission creep. So I don't think I have to tell any of you here, but as a reminder, we've had recent estimates of around 15 million people in modern day slavery. But that's an estimate. And we know that one of the greatest challenges has been actually on how to best estimate this number, with challenges on both the scale and nature of modern slavery. Paralleled with this are estimates that have been made around how much this costs, around 150 billion of illicit profits per year. And the UK in particular has tried to do some cost estimate about what it's costing the UK economy, and where it had initial estimates of around 10,000 people in modern day slavery, it estimated nearly 3.3 billion as a cost to the economy. But where we know some of those estimates have been more targeted at around 100,000, which then escalates that amount. So why are these numbers important? In part because it's also sometimes how it encourages, from a policy perspective, of resources to be put in place. So at the Turing, we started to engage with stakeholders, and some of these people, some of the stakeholders came to us specifically to speak to us about the challenges that they were facing. And this is just a very small summary or snapshot of some of the challenges, and that I will dig in just a little bit into in terms of some of the projects and the framework in which we're working within. So, as you know, when we heard just earlier around traffickers potentially on screen, so hiding behind screens, and the online potential harms. While much of this has been focused on sexual exploitation online, there is also recruitment of people online as well. Mentioned the profit and the illicit movement of sort of financial flows. We also have people that aren't necessarily captured in some of these global estimates that we have, as there are people that are potentially off-grid. Those that are at sea are one example, and they're only one example of that. Some of the challenges, again, just are around the fact that this is a hidden and sometimes hard to reach population. So when we are estimating from administrative data, various databases, we're not necessarily capturing that breadth. There's also, as we start to get into how we might use data and data science and AI based technologies, that there's an issue around the lack of ground truth. So we don't actually often know whether or not some pattern detection is a risk of modern slavery or trafficking, and that in itself is a social and a technical challenge in itself. There's also much data that is untapped, which is information that is often in narratives, and also in some digital footprints that we still just haven't learned how best to make use of in a meaningful way, but also in a way that is safeguarding those with lived experiences. The other greatest challenge that we started to both come across from researchers and our stakeholders across sectors was the issue around data sitting siloed. So on one hand, we can say that data is small because it's hidden populations we don't actually have access. They're sitting across public, private, nonprofit sector. On the other hand, we have these large digital footprints. Nonetheless, the data sitting siloed has often prohibited potential access and use of data science machine learning methods. So before I go on to share sort of some of our journey, of much of which I've captured here, is to say that we also started to discuss whether or not a socio-technical intervention was an appropriate response. And I'd like for people to keep that in the back of their minds, both in as they design or develop some of these tools, or in how these tools are evaluated. So again, this is just a snapshot of some of the things that we started to consider from both a data perspective, but also from the broader socio-technical kind of questions. So this was looking at who's not captured, the types of data around digital footprints in terms of both remote sensing technology as well as mobile phone data and untapped narratives. I'm going to share with you just the framing around two projects and then a third one that really links the two. So this first one is actually focused around what we've heard before, which is around sexual exploitation online. And what I'm sharing with you here is not the work in itself, which is in its early stages, but actually a framework that we started to engage with. And this was initially our involvement and decision to try and engage in this space was because we had law enforcement organizations that were saying we're being approached by companies that are saying that they have these tools that are being developed. And it wasn't sure that the tools were being developed that were fit for purpose. Often these were also tools that were being developed in the US. And then the request was that UK police forces use them. One, of course, is maybe the data in itself, but also just how the tool is designed and developed and whether or not it meets the needs. The other broader consideration, of course, was what does this mean in the broader ecosystem and what's needed from both a social science, an anthropology, a law, human rights perspective. So we started to take on what we refer to as a more participatory approach, which is to get multi-stakeholder engagement across the UK. So this started to engage with stakeholders across the UK's Home Office, National Crime Agency, and then police forces. We had one of these tools that had been developed, Telfinder, that was being potentially used by police forces that we started to engage with, and also some of the data that had been scraped and was being used through an adult service website. So started to engage with one of the adult service websites, which happens to have the UK's modern slavery helpline on the website. So why is that important? Because that was addressing some of the issues around ground truth. It's not a solid sort of ground truth, but it started to give us some links. At this point, it was also thinking about the fact that we needed a larger interdisciplinary research team, that it isn't and shouldn't just be technologists, those coming from statistics and computer science background, but it really needed those from across domain specializations, anthropology, law, human rights, that could really bring together what are the various questions that we're trying to engage with when we're trying to either design, develop, or deploy a tool such as one that addresses sexual exploitation online. So we came up with a set, and this is just a sample of some of the policy-related questions and the operational questions, but also the legal, ethical, human rights considerations. And from a responsible AI perspective, was considering some of those principles that needed to be considered in such a domain. And as Sherry said before, the other key thing for us was engaging with those people with lived experiences. And in an area such as sexual exploitation online, it means engaging with both survivors and sex workers. And this is to actually understand also whose data is it and whose data it's about, and what rights they should, what rights they have, not, and to examine the agency. The other area, again, you should start to see a theme emerging, was that one of the biggest things that we were being told was that this was an issue of greed in some ways. And so it was, can we disrupt the illicit financial flows? And while law enforcement has their law enforcement data, it was that they were trying at certain stages of investigation, engaging with financial institutions to get data to better detect the labor exploitation that was happening. And so the question and interest then became is how can we better leverage public and private data to tackle modern slavery? So we've been engaging in a series of both hackathons as well as just workshops to better understand what are the key issues. So again, some of the parallels from before are an issue of got financial transaction data, you've got law enforcement data. We're trying to bring this across sectors. There's a question about ground truth. And in order to bring these data together, there's an issue around responsible data flows and what that ecosystem and structure will be. So that has led to this our primary focus in this area, which has been around how to enable privacy, security, and trust for modern slavery data and policy innovation. So one of the main things that we hear is like, well, just share data. But this again is often data that is sensitive and proprietary. So we started to think about, well, what data could be shared and in what forms. And what we started to hear was a great excitement around data institutions, such as data trusts and data collaboratives, as well as using privacy enhancing technologies, such as ranging from synthetic data all the way to multi-party computation. So these really technical areas, but they're not a silver bullet. They don't actually address potentially some of the more underlying issues. So we just recently, as of a week ago, produced our initial insights from a stakeholder engagement from a series of surveys, workshops, and interviews that we did across the UK landscape with public, private, and nonprofit sector to actually understand what data is being collected, what are the issues around data access and data sharing, and like make a distinction between those two, and what's its value and its purpose in being shared. How do we think it will actually help to address modern slavery challenges? And so we found is that we had a set of problems. One is that data flows really poorly across the ecosystem. It's fragmented, often with black holes. There was a fair amount of competition and not cooperation. This was particularly seen within nonprofit sector, but even across the different sectors. There was legal ambiguity and confusion, particularly around data protection in the UK's GDPR, what is allowed, what isn't allowed. And sometimes maybe that was even seen as something to hide behind. There were few common standards, and there was a great concern around the privacy and agency of survivors of modern slavery. There were around 6 causes, but one particularly emphasized around distrust. This was distrust across institutions, a lack of reciprocity or feedback. So there was often the issue that this relates to black holes, that an institution might be giving data, but not necessarily giving back or feedbacking how that data is being used. They sometimes had incompatible sort of approaches or goals. And there was a real risk aversion, which really links back to some of the distrust issues. There's institutional dynamics were at play, and there was a great imbalance of power and resources. So this has primarily led to consequences that can be described as vicious cycles, poor accountability, missed opportunities, and survivors at the heart being further marginalized. So in terms of the approach that we've been trying to think about has really been around thinking about this as socio-technical opportunities, limitations, and mechanisms. So what are the questions? So rather than just saying there's a technical intervention, we need to think in terms of the entire ecosystem, life cycle, and environment in which these tools might play a role, and what can we leverage here? There's, again, going back to this sense that there's often AI is a silver bullet, or any of these tools are silver bullets, is thinking, well, are they? Even when we start to think about synthetic data, we know that there's still bias in there. Yes, there are mechanisms of which people are working on to make it more fair, less biased, but they're not silver bullets, and we need to be clear about that. Increasingly, the work that we're doing in the whole participatory approach is to really design by value. So whether that's privacy by design, non-discrimination, and trying to achieve what are those values, and potentially whether or not any of those are in conflict with each other, requires that multi-stakeholder approach. There are, of course, through the data science and AI sort of field, efforts around not just fairness, but transparency and accountability. And that is these frameworks around, or toolkits around, model cards and data sheets, which tries to actually emphasize the transparency around how the data is being used and how the algorithms are being designed, developed, and potentially deployed. I put in here that there's a parrot there for those who are less familiar. There's been a paper around stochastic parrots, and this actually really highlights not necessarily about that particular work, but the fact that some of these tools are also have really high energies. And so when we talk about sort of marginalized populations, it's recognizing how a tool being developed in one sort of country could then be deployed more globally, or just even within a country. The impacts of those tools being used, especially where there's much data, is not just about bias in the data, but also about its overall impact. So we're really trying to look at it holistically and across the entire, as I mentioned, ecosystem, life cycle, and environment. That means that at the moment, our approaches are slow, but we're hoping that slow is steady. So in summary, sort of engage around, I would say, 3 broad sets of questions, which is 1, how can we best design, develop, deploy, and sustain responsible data flows and AI interventions that draw on the legal, ethical, technical, and domain principles and challenges so that we can all benefit in a fair, just, and equitable way. It's considering how do we really unlock these data flows in a way that preserves privacy, and what does governance look like in a changing landscape and verse, particularly as was mentioned before, if we start to look at virtual reality and metaverse and how things are changing, this becomes a much bigger priority. And last but definitely not least is how do we design these in a way that thinks about diversity and inclusion, and that are not just in our R&D teams, which is still lacking in a priority, but also with the people with lived experiences. Summary, we've had a great number of people that have contributed to the work and the journey so far, and we are really still at the beginning. That's it. Thank you.